In this video, I'm going to be discussing the data validation failed message you can get when attempting to load a data file into sports photo automation. Now, this message is meant to catch a very specific issue, and you can get this message for a couple of different reasons. Some of those will cause problems with your data and some won't, which I'll explain in a little more detail later on in this video. But just know that if you get this message, it may or may not be an issue, but you need to understand what can cause this message to occur so you know if it's a problem in your situation or not. The second thing is, if you don't get this message, it doesn't mean your data is going to work, because this doesn't check everything in your data. It's just looking for one specific issue. So if we go to a data file here, this is the data file I just tried to load, which caused this issue. And if you're just looking at it in your spreadsheet, you might think, okay, everything looks good. I've got my data headers and my columns set up appropriately. But the issue in this case is it'll make more sense if I go to the notepad where I have this file open, because in a spreadsheet, you don't see the delimiters in that. And you don't also see the hidden formatting that Excel or your other spreadsheet programs do. So if we look at this CSV file, and CSV, by the way, stands for comma separated value. So what it's doing is a CSV file is just a text file, and then it uses hidden characters to format your data. So in between the columns, it puts commas. Like, for instance, in between the name and the team name here, you see we've got commas. And that's how the spreadsheet knows how to separate the data from a CSV file. Well, the issue comes with SPA, where it cannot handle data. Now, these are called delimiters, but if your delimiter character ends up in your data, for example, the file names have commas inside the file names, and also we've got a text column here that's got commas in the data. SPA is going to treat those as column separators. So it's going to separate this first part of the file name. It's going to separate that with the second part of the file name into separate columns. Now, how Excel and other spreadsheet programs handle this is if there's commas in your data and you're using a comma delimiter, it puts these hidden quotes around the data. Now, SPA does not recognize those hidden quotes as any kind of formatting characters. It can't use those. And the reason why is because different spreadsheet programs handle those differently. Sometimes those will come in with single quotes. Sometimes they'll be double quotes. Sometimes spreadsheet programs will put quotes around the data that doesn't have commas in it, if there's any commas in the data anywhere. And also if there's quotes in the data, then it starts doing other things where it puts curly quotes around straight quotes, and it just gets way too complicated and not really possible for me to program that into the plugin. So the plugin is just going to separate by the delimiter character. So that's the issue that's happening. So the solution is really simple here. With Sports Photo Automation version 10, you can use 4 different delimiters. So when you save your file, if you have commas in the data, you're going to save it. Now, you can save as either a CSV, TXT, or TSV. Those are the 3 extensions that Sports Photo Automation will recognize. However, there is no difference as far as Sports Photo Automation is concerned. There's no difference between any of those file extensions. So you can always just use the CSV extension if you want. But what you'll need to do is change the delimiter. So I'm in OpenOffice, or actually LibreOffice, which is a spin-off of OpenOffice. Excel will be the same way, though. There's an edit filter settings. Every spreadsheet program should, or the major ones should, have a way to establish what you're using for a delimiter. But if you hit edit filter settings here in OpenOffice and hit save, going to replace it, yes. then it's going to pop up the window where I can choose the field delimiter is the one you want. There's also a string delimiter, which the string delimiter is, oh, I closed it already, but the string delimiter is where it put the quotes around the data cells. SPA doesn't do anything with that, so the field delimiter is the one you want, and it will recognize comma, semicolon, colon, or tab. You can use any of those four. You can't use a space delimiter because that would cause issues with like text, for instance, where you have a space between a first and a last name. You don't want it to separate based on those. So I'll just choose semicolon here. And semicolon's a good one because typically you don't have semicolons in your text. So those are typically safe for the most part. So I'll just hit OK here. Now let's go back and reopen this data file in Notepad. So now you see that instead of the commas between the data cells, there's semicolons. There also is not quotes around the text item or the file names anymore that have commas in those. So now if I go to load that same file, you can see it loads with no problem. So that's what you need to do if you have commas in your data. Just use semicolon or tab or colon for a delimiter. I don't like tab because it's invisible if you look in Notepad. Like if you use tabs for your delimiter, you'll open it like this and you really won't be able to see the character. Colon is okay. Sometimes your data may have, or your text may have colons, and I've seen people do that, but I've never actually seen anybody use a semicolon in their text. So that's usually the safest one. Now I'll show you one other thing that can cause you to get this error even though your data still will work properly. So if you're using a data sheet that's got extra columns, Sports Photo Automation is only going to use the columns that it sees, or it's only going to use, it's only going to use columns in your data where it sees valid SPA headers. But if you have extra data in your spreadsheet, if you have a column of extra data, SPA will still work with that. It's just going to ignore that column. However, if you have a column of data with no header, let me save this here. Now if I try to upload this, it's going to give us this data validation failed message. And so the only thing this validation check is doing, and it says right here what it does, the number of data headers is not the same as the number of data columns. It says the data may or may not work properly depending on the cause of the issue. But this is a very simple check it's doing. All it's doing is counting the number of headers that it finds, and then it's comparing it to the number of columns of data. And so in this case, you have an extra column but no header, so that is tripping the error message because it thinks there could be a problem. And that's the only check it does. And it does that because it's an easy way to check if you have delimiters causing issues. So if this was saved a comma delimiter, for example, and it separated Boise and Idaho into separate columns here because of that delimiter issue, that would create the issue where you have more columns of data than you have headers. So that's the only check that it does. So if you get that error, and you may have extra data in your columns, also something else that can cause this is if you just simply have extra spaces. So let's say I enter some extra spaces here, and then I save this file. Make sure I'm going to use, make sure I'm still using semicolon. So even though I'm using semicolon and we have commas, that should work, but I have those extra spaces in there. And if I try to load that file, I get this error because it's finding those spaces and it thinks that's a part of your data, but there's no header associated with it. So if you see this error and you don't see anything else wrong, if you highlight all the columns to the right and delete those. And that, in this case, would have cleared any extra spaces. So now if I load it, it should work. So that that did load there. So hopefully this makes sense for what it's checking for and how to check for issues and fix the problem. The other thing I'll point out is just because it says the data file has been loaded and you get no warnings, that doesn't mean necessarily your data file is going to work. So I need to really stress that, because there's no way that it can possibly check your data file against your CSV, against the files in your folder. So if your files are named wrong and don't match what's in your folder, it's not going to work even though it told you it loaded with no issues. If you have a team name column here, but your PSD has that layer named incorrectly, your data file is not going to work to update those text layers. So even though you didn't get an error when you loaded your CSV, that doesn't mean you have your CSV formatted correctly. The only thing that means is there's no issues with delimiters causing issues. That's the only thing this is really looking for. So to sum it up, if you get that error, just make sure that you don't have commas in your data and you're saving as a comma delimited file. And then if you have commas, save with a semicolon delimiter and everything should work. Thanks for watching. Hope this helps.